Simone Voss was 41 years old, and for 10 years she had been the woman her husband introduced at industry events as his wife, in the same tone a man uses to point out adequate parking. She shopped at discount stores. She hemmed her own slacks. She drove a 12-year-old Buick with a slow leak in the rear passenger tire that she filled every Tuesday at the gas station on Peachtree Industrial. Because that was the kind of woman Garrett Voss had decided she was. The kind who made do and did not complain, and did not require anything that would reflect poorly on him. His colleagues' wives wore designer labels and had blowouts on Fridays, and Garrett had, on more than one occasion, looked at Simone across a crowded room and looked away again quickly, the way a man looks away from something he finds inconvenient. The night he told her she was an embarrassment, he was standing at the bathroom mirror in a tuxedo she had picked up from the cleaners that afternoon. And he said it the way he said most cruel things, casually, as if he were noting the weather. He said he was attending the Piedmont Developers Gala alone. He said she would not be joining him. He said she would understand. She understood perfectly. What Garrett did not know, what none of them knew, was that Simone had been a named partner of the architectural firm that designed the building where the gala was being held, and that the Rolls-Royce that pulled up to the valet stand that evening had been arranged 3 weeks in advance. $460,000. That was the value of the design contract her firm had executed for the Piedmont Grain 2 years prior, before Garrett had ever heard the venue's name. He walked in with a woman named Iris Conley on his arm. Certain he had left his embarrassment at home, he had no idea what was waiting for him inside. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. Atlanta mornings in late March came in slowly. The kind of light that filtered through bare branches at an angle that made everything look like a drawing of itself. Simone was at the drafting table she had built into the east wall of her home office before 6, with a mug of black coffee and a set of elevation drawings for a mixed-use project in Buckhead that her firm had been awarded in February. The table had taken her a full weekend to build. Solid walnut, a continuous surface 8 feet wide with a recessed light strip she had wired herself. And it was the most functional thing in the house, which was how she thought a good piece of work should be. She had grown up watching her grandfather, a man named Theodore Vance, draw house plans at his kitchen table in Macon for people who could not afford an architect. He was not licensed. He worked from observation and study and 30 years of building things by hand, and every house he ever sketched was still standing. He had died when Simone was in her first year of graduate school and had left her 2 things, a set of drafting pencils in a leather roll, and a sentence she had carried into every room she had ever designed. He had said, "The structure you cannot see is the one that holds everything else up." She had understood, even then, that he was talking about more than buildings. She had met Garrett at a fundraiser in Midtown 11 years ago, when she was 30 and he was 35, and working his way up through a commercial real estate development firm with the kind of relentless surface charm that photographs well and wears thin at close range. He had been attentive in those early years. He had asked about her work. He had come to her project openings and stood beside her with his hand at the small of her back and looked proud in a way that she had believed was real. At some point, the belief had quietly outlasted the evidence. She had kept believing anyway, because she had made a commitment, and because she was not a woman who abandoned things she had invested in without cause. She had cause now. He had kissed her cheek on his way through the kitchen that morning, his phone face down in his jacket pocket. A habit so established she had stopped noticing it until recently. He said he had dinner with clients. She said she hoped it went well. He poured a cup of coffee he did not finish and left at 7:15, trailing a cologne she had not purchased. Only her business partner and her attorney knew the full shape of what she had been building for the last 4 years. Garrett had never once asked about the second set of books. The signal came on a Thursday evening, 3 weeks before the gala, when Simone returned from a client walkthrough in Decatur to find a cream-colored envelope on the kitchen counter. It was addressed to Garrett. It had been opened and resealed poorly, the kind of resealing a person does when they are in a hurry and not thinking about what they leave behind. She recognized the return address as the Piedmont Grand. She had attended the building's ribbon cutting 2 years prior, had stood in the lobby she helped design and watched the developer give a speech, and had not corrected anyone who assumed she was a guest rather than the architect of record. The envelope contained 2 tickets to the Piedmont Developers Gala. Black tie, Saturday, April the 14th. The tickets were issued in Garrett's name and a guest. She set the envelope back on the counter exactly as she had found it. She poured herself a glass of water. She stood at the kitchen window and looked at the backyard where she had planted a row of river birch trees along the back fence the previous spring, 5 of them spaced at measured intervals, already beginning to show their paper bark in the low evening light. Her face was perfectly calm. She went to her office. She opened her laptop. She did not begin with the gala tickets. She began with the calendar she had been maintaining in a private folder for 7 months, a record of patterns she had noticed and filed the way she filed everything, without drama, without confrontation, with the patient attention of someone who knew that a structure's weakness only becomes visible once you understand how it was built. The Thursday client dinners that never produced a named client. The weekend conference in Savannah that she later found had no conference on record. The American Express statement she had seen once, by accident, and which listed a jewelry purchase of $3,400 at a boutique in Virginia Highland, a boutique she had never visited, for a piece she had never received. She cross-referenced the statement dates against Garrett's calendar entries. 11 overlaps in 9 months. The pattern was complete, and it was deliberate, and it had been running for the better part of a year while she hemmed her own slacks and filled the slow leak in her tire every Tuesday, and told herself that distance in a marriage was sometimes just the shape of 2 people working hard. She photographed the credit card statements with her phone. She forwarded the calendar records to her personal encrypted account. She downloaded the 3 months of joint banking records she still had access to and found, buried in the routine withdrawals, a series of ATM transactions totaling $19,600 over 6 months, always in amounts of $400 to $600, always on days she could now match to specific entries in the pattern calendar. He had been funding it in cash, to keep it off a paper trail he did not know she was already following. She opened a new folder on her desktop. She named it simply Structure. Then she picked up her phone and sent a single message to a woman named Claudette Marsh, who had been her attorney for 8 years and who approached legal strategy the way Simone approached load-bearing design, from the inside out, starting with what had to hold. The message said, "I'm ready to move. Can we meet Monday?" Claudette replied in 6 minutes, 8 o'clock. "Bring the folder." Real power, her grandfather had told her, does not announce itself ahead of time. Monday morning, Simone sat across from Claudette in an office in Midtown, with the structure folder on the table between them, and watched Claudette read without expression for 12 minutes. When Claudette finished, she closed the folder and took off her reading glasses and said what she always said when the evidence was complete and unambiguous. She said, "He doesn't know about Vance Studio." Simone said, "No." Claudette said, "Not the revenue, not the contracts, not the ownership structure." Simone said, He knows I work in architecture. He has never once asked what that means financially." Claudette picked up her pen. "Then we have considerably more leverage than he does. And he has no idea." Vance Studio, named for her grandfather, had been incorporated as an independent architecture firm 6 years ago, when Simone had quietly separated her personal practice from the larger firm where she worked. Taking 3 loyal clients and a small operating account that she had seeded with savings Garrett did not know she had accumulated. The firm had grown. It now carried 4 active commercial contracts and a staff of 7, and its retained earnings account held $780,000. The Piedmont Grand contract alone had been invoiced at $460,000 over 22 months. Every dollar of it was hers and hers alone, structured under advice from Claudette before the first invoice was ever sent. Garrett had never seen a tax return that reflected it. He had never asked. He had decided, a long time ago, what kind of woman she was, and that kind of woman did not require investigation. 2 days later, Simone drove out to Macon to visit her uncle Bertram, her grandfather's youngest brother, who was 77 and lived in the house Theodore Vance had designed in 1969 and which was still as sound as the day it was built. They sat on the front porch in the early April warmth, and Simone told him what she had found and what she intended to do. Bertram listened the way the Vance men always listened, without interruption, without urgency, with the settled patience of people who understood that the right response to most things was to let them finish before speaking. When she was done, he looked out at the yard for a moment, and then he said, "Theodore always told me, a building that looks weak from the outside and holds from the inside, that's the most honest thing a person can make." She held those words on the drive back to Atlanta and let them do what good words always do, which is settle into the place where the uncertainty lives and make it quieter. By Friday, Claudette's investigator had built the profile on Iris Conley. She was a corporate event planner who had worked the ribbon cutting at the Piedmont Grand, which meant she had been in the building that Simone designed on the day it opened, and had met Garrett there. The timeline placed the beginning of their arrangement approximately 19 months ago. She drove a leased vehicle she was 2 months behind on. She had a personal line of credit that was nearly at its ceiling. The jewelry purchase, a bracelet, the investigator confirmed, had been a gift for a birthday that fell on one of the calendar dates Simone had flagged. He had used their joint cash to buy another woman a bracelet in a building his wife had designed. Simone noted this without comment. She filed it. That Friday evening she made dinner. She set the table with the care she brought to everything. She asked Garrett how his week had gone, and he said fine, and she passed him the bread and asked about an upcoming deal he had mentioned, and he brightened slightly, the way he always brightened when given an audience. And she listened and asked one follow-up question and cleared the plates and said she was turning in early. He did not look at her closely enough to see anything unusual. She had already called the Rolls-Royce hire company on Wednesday. The Piedmont Grand stood in Buckhead at the intersection of 2 wide boulevards, 40 stories of glass and steel, and the particular geometric rhythm in the curtain wall system that was Simone's signature, a pattern that her industry knew, and that anyone who had followed her firm's work would recognize immediately. She had not been back to the building since the ribbon cutting. She had let it stand without her presence, the way her grandfather always said the best work stood. The car arrived at her door at 7:15 on Saturday evening. The driver held the door. She wore a dress, the color of deep garnet that she had commissioned from a seamstress in Sweet Auburn 3 years prior, and had been waiting for the right occasion. She wore her grandfather's drafting pencils in a small case in her evening bag, not for use, but because some things you carry as a reminder of what you come from. The valet line at the Piedmont Grand was 4 cars deep when the Rolls pulled up. The attendant stepped forward. The doors to the lobby were glass, her specification, and the foyer was lit from below with the indirect cove lighting system she had drawn by hand at the drafting table in her home office. She stepped out of the car into the full sight of the arriving crowd. She was watching. Garrett and Iris Conley were standing at the registration table just inside the lobby. She saw him first, his back to the entrance, in the same tuxedo she had collected from the cleaners. She saw the moment the murmur moved through the crowd near the door, and he turned to see what had shifted the room's attention. She saw his face move through its stages: recognition, confusion, something that flickered between fear and the social instinct to perform composure. In the space of 4 seconds, she walked past the registration table without stopping. The event director, a woman named Patricia, who had worked the Piedmont Grand's opening events, stepped forward and said, "Miss Voss, we're so pleased you could be here. Your firm's work on this building is the reason this room exists." She said it clearly. She said it to the room. Several heads turned. Several conversations paused. A man near the bar, she recognized him as one of the Piedmont development partners, raised his glass in her direction. Garrett had gone still. Claudette had prepared a single document for this evening, a notarized summary of Vance Studios' contractual relationship with the Piedmont Grand project, with the contract value itemized and the architectural credits listed in full. It was not a legal instrument. It was a piece of paper that said, in clear professional language, what Simone had built, and what it was worth, and whose name was on it. Claudette had suggested it. Simone had agreed. She carried one copy in her evening bag. She crossed the foyer to where Garrett was standing, and she handed him the document without preamble and without raising her voice. She said, "This is the building you brought her to. I designed it." He looked at the document. He looked up at her. Iris Conley had taken a small step backward. He said her name. He said he could explain the gala, that it was a business obligation, that Iris was a professional contact, that he had been going to tell her. A woman standing nearby, the wife of one of the development partners, a woman who had been at the ribbon cutting 2 years prior and who had asked Simone intelligent questions about the curtain wall system, said quietly, and without unkindness, "This is the architect who built this room. Everything she's standing in, she designed." The silence that followed was of the particular quality that only comes when a room full of people understands something simultaneously. Simone looked at Garrett for a long moment. He was holding the document with both hands, and his expression had moved fully past composure into something smaller and more honest than anything she had seen from him in years. She said, "You spent 10 years deciding I was something to be managed and minimized. I spent those same years building something you couldn't see. Those are 2 very different uses of time. I know which one I'd choose again." She took back the document. She folded it once and placed it in her evening bag. She said good evening to the development partner, who had raised his glass. She thanked Patricia for the introduction. She walked to the far side of the room, where the floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over the Buckhead lights, and she stood there with a glass of sparkling water, and she spoke to 3 people who wanted to talk about architecture, and she did not look back at the entrance where Garrett was standing. She had built this room. She was standing in it. That was enough. 9 months later, the Atlanta summer had finally loosened its grip, and the early days of November had come in cool and clean. And Simone Vance, she had returned to her grandfather's name with a legal filing so unremarkable she had handled it herself, was in the workshop she had built off the back of the house she purchased in Ormwood Park, a 1940s bungalow on a corner lot that she had been renovating board by board since August. The workshop smelled like sawdust and linseed oil. She was planing the edge of a cabinet door she was making for the kitchen. A walnut cabinet that would anchor the east wall, the way her old drafting table had anchored hers, and she was thinking about the grain pattern and the way it would catch the morning light when she heard the side door open and a man named Andre Holloway came in carrying 2 cups of coffee from the kitchen, stepping carefully over the drop cloth, setting 1 cup on the workbench beside her without interrupting the work. Andre taught urban planning at Georgia Tech. He had come to a presentation her firm gave in October and had asked afterward, without performance, whether she would want to have coffee and talk about neighborhood design. She had said yes. He was thoughtful and curious, and he did not require anything from her that she was not freely offering, which was the most important thing she had learned to look for. Vance Studio had taken on 2 new commercial clients in the fall. A landmark adaptive reuse project in West End had been awarded to the firm for $620,000, and she had been asked to speak at a symposium in the spring on design ethics and community impact. She had said yes to both. She had heard about Garrett through a mutual contact at the end of the summer. He had resigned from the development firm in June under circumstances the contact described as mutual and immediate, and which Simone understood without needing the specifics. He was consulting independently from an apartment in Sandy Springs. Iris Conley had moved out of state. His closest professional mentor, a man who had championed Garrett's career for 12 years, had stopped returning his calls after the gala, when the architectural credits had circulated through the industry the following week, and the story of what had happened in the lobby became the kind of story a city that sighs tells itself for a season. Simone did not linger there. She had learned, in the months since, that the opposite of someone who diminishes you is not someone who celebrates you. It is simply the room you build for yourself, the one that is exactly the right size, the one where everything is where you put it, and nothing is where you didn't. She ran the plane down the edge of the cabinet door. A long, thin curl of walnut fell to the drop cloth. The grain came clean and true beneath. The structure you cannot see, her grandfather had said, is the one that holds everything else up. She had built hers. It was holding. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.